definitely seems to connect something in relation to the. Sorry about that. I tried to get rid of the recording and process thing and did something else instead. Okay, we'll stick with that. It doesn't seem like it wants to do it now. Anyway, yeah, I was going to say we could have thrown in the environmental thing, which of course in Glasgow in particular, we're very concerned about that at the moment because we've got this big conference coming up in a couple of weeks' time, actually. And so in fact, some of you might have seen on social media a prayer that we've written, the two of us, for an event that Olive was part of in Trinity College, Glasgow. Was it yesterday?
Last night, yeah, same time.
Same time, yeah. Okay. What else have we got here? Yeah, well, here's some insights from various research. This has all come from, if we ask ourselves what has been going on in the last 18 months, then here we've got research that largely comes from Durham University, its Digital Theology research group. And it tells a really interesting story here that when we were thrown into this 18 months ago, 85% of all UK churches did something to connect with people using the medium of the digital medium of online, whatever that might have meant. A third of those churches created pre-recorded material. 45% produced real-time programs, which was, when you think of people who were in churches who'd never done any of this stuff before, to be ready to do real-time stuff and put yourself out there with all the possibility of making a mess of it and not being able to get it to change it, to make it better, I think that showed a degree of courage for one thing, and also experimentation and imagination that perhaps you wouldn't have thought many of us actually had to go for it like that. Repeatedly, we've met with people and talked with people who said, well, actually, you know, our midweek prayer meeting in particular has had new life as a result of us not needing to go to a church building. And largely that's been due to people saying, well, actually, yeah, I never could make it for 7 o'clock at night because I didn't get home from work till like 6:30. And I then had to have some food and be at least polite to the other people who live in my house, whereas actually I could just turn on the computer in the corner and be part of it. And if I really wanted, I could close my camera down so nobody knew that I was eating my tea at the same time. And I guess some of you will have had that same experience of your prayer meetings or other midweek groups really taking off in terms of attendance and engagement. And
different generations, where there was small children in the house, where if there were two parents in the house, they couldn't both get out. So they could, provided the kids were off to bed or occupied, could actually be part of it. So, and particularly with dark nights coming in, a lot of elderly people don't really want to go out. There's safety, you know, if it's bad weather or just fear of the dark or not being able to get a lift. So, and people who would have had different sorts of disabilities that prevented them, it's made it very accessible for many people, which wasn't the case before.
No, it wasn't.
Much more easily accessible.
Yes, yeah. Now, it becomes a surprise when you discover that 55% of churches, more than half of them, had bigger online numbers than they'd ever had recently, at least in their buildings. 45% of them had smaller numbers, but notice this one, that 25% of them more than doubled their engagement. Now, of course, those figures kind of hide a few things because it's notoriously difficult to count online engagement. For example, some of you, I'm not looking at what you're doing with your screens now, but you all know that it would be possible to turn your camera off, mute yourself, and go off and do something entirely different, and then come back in 30 minutes' time here and look as if you'd been engaged the whole time. So counting is rather complicated, but these are significant numbers, I think, because they were sustained throughout the period of lockdowns and so on. The negative side of this, of course, is that somewhere around about 30% of regular churchgoers fail to connect at all. Some of them just transferred and engaged with different churches, and others just dropped out. I think that figure is quite significant because information that's coming in now that churches have begun meeting again in something that looks like what we did before, a figure of somewhere around about 30 to 40% down seems to be quite a common experience anyway. So maybe some of those 30% of people who didn't connect were just people who were going to drop out of church anyway, or had big questions and issues. But of course, there's also the question of some older people who didn't have the technology or the ability or the connections or whatever. And of course, others who, because they were struggling with all sorts of economic issues, didn't have the kind of houses, for example, that would easily lend themselves to that kind of engagement on a regular basis. But the next one that's down here is also interesting, that 25% plus ranges, depending on which surveys you look at, somewhere between 25% and about 28% of the population appear to have connected regularly with something that could be called online worship. Mostly YouTube, some Facebook, whereas the previous usual attendance, as you all know, was more or less around about 6% of the UK population would have regarded themselves as having any sort of regular connection with a church. An even more significant one is that more than half of young adults, that is people aged 18 to 34, connected. Especially interesting in prayer, things like the daily office, Compline, as well as connecting with worship services. Now, that is a statistic that is well borne out with our experience here, because when the whole business started, you might recall that, well, you were probably invited by some local group or other to take care of your community. There will be people who need groceries delivered, people who need medications delivered. Will you volunteer to do that? And when I saw that, I ticked some of those boxes, but on the form or the website, whatever it was that I was engaged with, website, I think, there was another box that said, is there anything else you would like to offer? And in that box, I said I could offer spiritual care. Now, those are words that I chose very carefully. Care was already in there because people were saying, let's care for our community. And of course, I had a good idea that spirituality would be a good word to use for a whole variety of reasons. And I didn't expect to hear much about it, to be honest. But within no time at all, I was getting inquiries. People referred to me who'd gone to that website and said, yes, I would love to have a conversation with somebody about my spiritual care, which could range from lots of different things, of course, because the word spirituality is so appealing because it's so ambiguous and can mean lots of different things to different people. But one thing that struck me right away was that there was a preponderance of young men in particular, more young men than young women, in pretty much exactly that age group that's mentioned there. I would say maybe 18s to maybe 40s rather than 34. And their questions were all about prayer, like way out in front of anything else. And it was interesting that I don't recall having a conversation with anybody asking the kind of traditional questions that Christians would think of. Things like, why are good people suffering like this? Those big kind of philosophical, ideological questions just didn't seem to feature. The questions were much more oriented to, okay, so how do I get from today through to tomorrow and with some kind of connection with myself and with some sort of transcendent reality, whoever or whatever that is, i.e. prayer. And I mean, I got some very strange questions. Not just what is prayer, but how do you pray? I mean, what are you supposed to do? And is it all right for me to pray if I'm not sure whether I'm a person of faith or not? And other people were asking, what if can you get it wrong? What happens if you get the prayer wrong? Which had a sort of backstory to it, which was something like, well, if the God I'm not sure I believe in gets angry with me, what's going to happen next? And to date, I mean, it's dropped off a lot now, obviously, but to date, I've certainly connected with somewhere around about 3,000 people in the last 18 months. And I know roughly how old they are because virtually all of them wanted this kind of conversation face to face. So it's guesswork and anecdotal to some extent, what I'm saying, but that is where we're at, I think, in a big sort of way, that so many young adults have connected, being given permission to ask these kinds of questions, which tells us something. So why did this happen? Well, you can see the red boxes at the bottom here. I think in some respects, it was a kind of retro experience, you know? It was like going back to the 1950s. There was nothing else to do on a Sunday because everything else was closed and you couldn't go anywhere. So what else did you do but turn on the television or your computer or whatever and see what was out there that might look vaguely interesting? And of course, we got lots of visitors from other churches, didn't we? People who once were part of our churches but now live on the other side of the country or even the other side of the world, or people who were just curious to see what was going on. So I think we can feed that in, but that is still a lot of people when you look at those percentages there. So clearly we did connect overall, not every church, obviously, but overall, Christians connected with more people as a consequence of the pandemic than would otherwise have been the case.
And I think that pushes us to think, here's an opportunity, it's a bit like a window that we need to act now, not just sort of think and discuss and talk for a long, long time. We might not feel we know exactly what to do, but it's worth trying to keep that connection going. The online church, who's it connecting with? Well, you'll have your own list of people that you think, but we've already mentioned housebound people, people sick one way or another, elderly, but also people who were really afraid of going out, people who had to self-isolate for medical conditions because they were more vulnerable. And that, of course, created lots of problems mentally. Lots and lots of people have found that their mental health has taken a bit of a bash, so some more seriously than others. People, when they were working, when on-site church meets, were able to go. And I think that's been quite important, often as well because people recorded services as well as them being on. They were able to listen at a different time. People who did have to travel for their work, because there still were people like that, and of course in a much more isolated world, still felt they had some place of connection. People trying church out who may come on site eventually, but not now. They're sort of having a look at us, a bit like being stalked, really. But I think this shows how important our online presence is, whether that's church, what church is putting on, or individually. I found a significant number of people I've had one-to-one connections with because I know them in some social platform. And they've asked me these sorts of questions that John was asking, was telling you about through the spiritual care program. Contacts around the world. I heard people saying as well who are maybe living in a different country and couldn't get back home, or were feeling very distanced from their families. And the only way they could meet was online. So Zoom for them became a real gift. I know even for myself, I ended up doing a bit of homeschooling for my grandchildren who live nowhere near me. I'm in Scotland, they're in Wales. And I was doing baking online with them. But it's enabled that kind of connection. That wasn't church, but that whole thing about how do we nurture, because church life isn't just about turning up at services. So how about all the other range of things that are around church, the mentoring, the looking out for one another, the caring, noticing that somebody's missing? How does all that kind of thing help? Or your intuition that, well, I haven't even spoken to that person or had an email or been online. I wonder if they're all right. It happened to me only yesterday. I phoned up somebody who I hadn't heard from for 2 or 3 weeks. And because I usually do, I was beginning to think, and I phoned up. And the answer was, we've both had COVID. We're just about coming out. I was really glad that I'd got in touch. And then digital natives, those of us in my kind of age group, we have to work at the digital stuff and keep asking the same questions over and over again. But for young people, that's where they live. You ask them about a friend and you say, where did you meet them? And they look at you and they're like, oh, well, I haven't met them face to face. They're just somebody I know because I met them online. So that's a lot going on. But I think what's a real surprise about this new generation of spiritual searchers, on one hand, you've got somebody like Russell Brand has recently been putting videos up. He's been doing it for quite a while, but he's been talking about prayer. And only yesterday or the day before, we came across a survey published in The Guardian, particularly aiming, I think it was teenage to about 35 age group of people. Oh, yes, it's there. It says 18 to 34. I remembered it reasonably well. How do they express their spiritual side? Now, if two kind of quite iconic mediums there in our society are taking this and, putting it out, it says there's something going on that we need to sit up and pay attention to, I think.
It certainly does, yes, because Russell Brand, if you go to YouTube and look at any of his videos, you'll see that he has hundreds of thousands, and in some cases millions of followers listening, and he's talking about prayer in a very kind of upfront, practical way as well, isn't he?
Which you might not have believed a few years ago.
You would not. Well, he says he wouldn't.
He says that he talks
actually
about what we would actually refer to as a kind of testimony or a journey. Where he's at in that spiritual journey is not for us to judge, but it's interesting what's happening.
Yeah. So how about the new future? Well, we've got all those things down the left that we're all familiar with, that more people are working at home. More people seem to be both in work and out of work. At one time, we were doing so much shopping, there was a shortage of cardboard boxes because we were getting so much stuff delivered. Hospitality's being impacted, sport, and then the whole thing of poverty is coming in there. So if you're looking for an agenda for mission, then those are some of the key things, not the only things that we need to be reflecting on. But I think we need to be aware that how different church people, I'm using the word church there in terms of, the people who are the church rather than gatherings or buildings. I think it's changed the members of churches, lifestyles, health very often, fear. There will be an element that once you get out of the habit, I know it's easy to criticize people who see church as a habit, but to be honest, once you get out of the habit of connecting with a church congregation on a Sunday morning, then it's harder than you think, harder than most of us think, to actually rediscover that habit, because something else will have come in to fill that point in your life. A lot of churches are having financial challenges, individuals who've perhaps got demands that they didn't have before, congregations who were funded effectively by people who physically attended and put money in plates or bags. In particular, those kinds of contributions have just disappeared. We're now discovering actually that some of the people who we thought were not important in church life, tech-savvy people, they might actually be the key figures taking us forward into this new digital world. And overall, I think there's a growing awareness of a need for new ways of doing stuff. I mean, it's a good question, that one we put in there. Will people who've loved informal interaction on Zoom go back to just sitting and saying nothing and listening to long sermons? You know, and will those of us who preach those sermons, who've discovered that actually sitting in front of a computer is a different thing to standing 10 feet above contradiction or whatever, that it's a different style that's required, a different kind of more informal kind of presentation that's required. There's just a general sense, I think, that whatever we now do can't be just going back, or at least we'll have missed something really important if we just go back to where we were.
And I think it throws up very much the same thing's been coming through children's engagement or disengagement with online, with school and with learning, that it's not just about listening to the teacher's voice, it's how do we engage? And I think that that point about engagement, we have to do things differently to invite people to engage online. And there's something here about, we've got technology and we've got a medium that can do different things. We have a responsibility to discover what those things are.
We do, yes.
And it's not even just about words and printing. I mean, you can draw, you can do a paint, you can paint on a screen.
You can.
Yeah. I've learned more from my grandchildren. So, I mean, actually, maybe having somebody who's about 6 or 7 on the deciding committees might be really helpful.
Yeah. I mean, these things in the bottom are really interesting because most of the challenges, there's nothing new in this, really. The manifestations and symptoms of it are new, maybe, but fundamentally, the changes that have been forced upon us would all have happened anyway, but maybe they'd have taken 10 years for them to happen, whether in society or in lifestyles more generally, or in church life in particular. So really what the pandemic has done has said, look, you know, this needs to be addressed. Missional questions, structural questions, questions of what it means to be church. Now you can't avoid them any longer. And for many of you, it's going to be a matter of life or death. And we know a number of congregations for whom that is literally the case. They are now at a point where they literally will have to change or just go out of existence. It's as simple as that. So it's focusing minds in ways that, we want to finish this with a rather a more encouraging kind of note, don't we? Yeah.
A unique opportunity for change. Yes, it's so unique. We're kind of like rabbits caught in the headlines and the headlights some of the time. The virus it stopped us short, didn't it? Because we all just got really busy. But it's not just about busyness that's not going to produce the goods. It can be very easy to be busy and then feel that, well, we're doing the right thing just because we've got too much to do. Just think of all the extra number of meetings that we really don't need to have. One of the things that's made us realize it is when we're on Zoom and we know that after being on Zoom for an hour, it's recommended that, you should get up and be doing stuff, move around. It's exhausting and people have found it really exhausting. So why do we need so many meetings? Or do we need, if we haven't got an agenda and questions that really need answered, it's easy enough to cancel a meeting. I think we're finding that. And we can do things in different ways. We can ask really basic questions and focus on the purpose, instead of getting sidetracked. And we can let go of some things and reimagine and repurpose. I mean, some of the things that would have been done in the past, there are things like meditation, reflection. It is interesting how, for many people, that's coming to the fore as the way that has helped them through the pandemic. Well, what does it mean spiritually to have time of space and reflection? And learning from our experience, deep and wide, that was an old song when I was a kid in Sunday school. Many people are spiritually thirsty. That is so true. I mean, I had a message from somebody who I know well, lives nowhere near me, lives hundreds of miles away in the south, but is a pagan. And I got a question from her saying, wait for it, are there any places in the Bible that I could look at in relation to this problem that I've got? That was probably the last question I expected from her. But it started a deeper conversation going on about all sorts of things. And again, particularly about prayer. It's not just about being trendy. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we can make if we think, just tinkering with the edges and maybe doing something with some music or maybe with some graphics. It's much more basic than that. We've got things in our tradition that I was talking about this to a group on Monday nights that I'm teaching in Glasgow University. Having gone into a coffee shop and picked up a book that was on rituals, and the sort of things that were in this book were, wait for it, cleansing, anointing, refreshment. And this is a book that's just being sold on a shelf, in the station sort of bookshop with all the magazines, people picking that up and looking at it. So what are the things that are not just things we think about, but the things that we do? I mean, the same question comes in to any congregation. If you're in leadership or a minister, how do you motivate what you're speaking about or talking about to translate beyond the sermon so that it's something that people carry and do and practice that enriches them 24/7? So we have lots of ancient traditions that perhaps recycling, upcycling, as a term that we use today, might be something that we should be thinking about. Recreating community where people can connect and easily be fully human, opening our doors wide. I mean, the project last night that won the Sterling Architectural Prize this year was one that's in Kingston, but it's part of a university, but it's been built with the expectation, and the design of it is so that people almost flow in off the street and they don't have to, like, going to, well, certainly some church offices I know in Scotland you go to, you almost need frisk to go through the door, or you need to show a pass for wire. But it was so that people would drift in and be part of. And that particular university, most of the students, they're the first person in their family who've gone on to further study. But the whole of the architect who designed, the lead architect, was actually saying in his speech afterwards, it's been designed so that you can go right into the whole building and up to the top and see out over the whole area. You can use the computers, you can have access to all the other things that are there. And if you think about how we're talking today in church, how do we create community? How do we do that within the communities where we live? What's this last bit? Be mobile, go where people are. Well, that's a big thing, isn't it? Not expecting them to come into us. And sometimes that's been our big mistake in the church. We always issue an invitation to come to a service, or how about coming in, which really is about inviting them onto our territory where we're comfortable, and don't know if there's any football fans among, I can see all ladies' faces there at the moment. Not that you wouldn't watch football, but if all games are played at home, you don't reckon very much to the team. So what does it mean to be in somebody else's space? And what does it mean to be online with other people? Without having to control, mute everybody and tell them, like I'm doing just now.
Absolutely, yes, right. Well, that's us done, I think. So we will move on. We've told you a bit about ourselves there, as well as how we've seen what we've seen, how we've seen things. So we're now going to go into, let me see, there are 20, I think if we're going to 3 breakout rooms,
one will have 8.
that gives us that gives us easy numbers, big enough for everybody to have a say if they want to have a say, and big enough that you can stay silent if you wish to be as well. So I think what we're going to do with that, we've got a few questions here, which we're going to put in the chat. and I'll just paste them in there. And these are the questions, okay? So you can all see them in the chat. What have we lost? We're thinking now in terms of your local church, okay? So there won't be a blanket set of answers to these questions. What have we lost during the pandemic that you think, thank goodness, we don't need to do that anymore? What have we lost that should be recovered? Things that are still serviceable and useful as we go forward. What new things have been gained that we seriously need to keep or maybe develop into new directions? What was necessary and useful for the time of the pandemic, but frankly, that was then and this is now, and we don't need to continue that in the future. And then if you have time, well, I suppose talking about those, you're bound to actually interweave the challenges of doing something about it throughout